Chair Berkowitz is not here on time, so as vice chair, I'm going to get the meeting started. This is the regular meeting for the Redwood Coast Transit Authority, Friday, May 31st at 1:30. Can you call the roll?
Director Roberts.
Here.
Director Kine.
Here.
Director Gitlin.
Here.
And Director Tallman.
Here. Okay, next we're going to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. Thank you. Next up is public comment. Any member of the public wishing to speak on anything within the Transit Authority's purview is invited to do so now. You got 3 minutes. Okay. Nothing? All right. Seeing no public comment, we're going to move on to our consent calendar. Item 4A, approve Amendment 3 to Heron/TMTP contract to expand scope to include the advertising revenue program and extend contract by 2 years at the terms approved by the Board of Directors at the February 22nd meeting. And item 4B, adopt Resolution 2018-1908, authorizing revised application to Caltrans for RCTA's fiscal year 2018-19 allocation of LCTOP funds, and authorizing the general manager to execute grant documents.
Motion to approve.
We have a motion to approve the consent calendar. Is there a second?
I'll second that.
Okay. Any public? Yes.
Mr. Chair, if I could just explain, item 4B is on there because in February, the board did approve the original application project list, but Caltrans rejected one element, which was the Saturday service restoration, and directed us to put all the funds into the other project, which is the free fares program. So that happened afterwards. So this is to correct that and make the resolution match the project list.
Thank you. Any public comment on the consent calendar? No? Okay. Then, yeah, we got a motion and a second, so let's call the vote.
Director Roberts.
I'm sorry,
Consent calendar, just,
Oh,
yeah.
yes.
Sorry.
You're all good.
Director Kine.
Yes.
Director Gitlin.
Yes.
And Director Tallman.
Yes. Okay, the motion passes. Next, we're going to move on to item 5, the minutes of April 22nd, 2019. Any corrections, additions, deletions to the minutes that the board needs to make? Nothing? Any public comment on the minutes? Okay.
Motion
well,
to approve.
We got a motion. Do we got a second?
Second.
Thank you. Motion and a second. Can you call the vote?
Director Roberts.
Yes.
Director Kine.
Yes.
Director Gitlin.
Yes.
Vice Chair Tallman.
Yes, thank you. Okay, next up, item 6, approve the remainder of the CY 2019 RCTA board meeting calendar.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. This item is coming back. We've discussed it a little bit earlier in the calendar year. Each calendar year, we adopt a schedule of meetings. We tend to meet about every other month with additional meetings as necessary, so we're probably averaging 7 or 8 meetings per year, and that this year will end up being no different. We've been trying to search for a set day. We've been setting the meetings 1 or 2 meetings in advance so far this year, seeking a new date that'll be either a Monday or Friday that makes it easier for me to reach these board meetings because I do live afar. The last time we met, staff was asked to look at either Fridays or Mondays. Fourth Monday was preferred among some members of the board, fourth Friday at others. There was no unanimous consensus at that point. I did verify that both the slots we're looking at, which should be the fourth Monday, which is like today from 1:30 to 3:30, is available, and indeed another meeting is after that some of our board overlaps with our board members on that. That's the LAFCO meeting. That's at 4 on the fourth Monday. The fourth Friday is also open. So at this point, staff recommending just to keep us going so that we can calendarize the rest of the meetings after the next one. So we are slated to meet on Monday, June 24th, which is also the fourth Monday. But after that, we've got nothing scheduled. So we're recommending that we go ahead and take this fourth Monday slot at 1:30 to 3:30 for the rest of the year. Probably be 3 more meetings, most likely August, October, and either November or December. Yeah, so that's a staff recommendation at this point. And then if it's working well, we could roll with that into next year. If not, we can address it in case there's any changes in juxtaposition of board members, which happens at the start of each calendar year.
Joe, I think it's a good recommendation. You're aware, of course, the fourth Monday is we have a LAFCO meeting at 4 o'clock. So when you're scheduling these meetings on the fourth Monday of the month, at 1:30 would be the preferred time. Normally, it's an hour schedule. Of course, we always run over. So even if we go to 3:30, I don't see it being a problem. I don't think it conflicts with anything city, which is the first and third Monday. So I like it, and I'll make that motion to make that fourth Monday at 1:30 for the rest of the calendar fiscal year 2019.
Okay.
And 2020, because it goes into the new year, doesn't it?
Yes, but we
Your
have,
fiscal year.
our board appointments change around the start of each calendar year, so we could do fiscal year, whichever the board prefers.
No, I think
Calendar year
I
would be
want to
minimum,
correct
right?
that. So make it for the calendar year through December.
That'd be great.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, why did staff decide Monday instead of Friday?
The board's going to decide right here.
Yeah.
We're recommending
Well,
Monday
recommend,
because
yeah.
it seemed to make sense because 2 of the board members already have to be here, but I know it doesn't work as well for everybody, so it's totally up to this board. I'm fine with either one.
Okay. What do you think works best for you and the organization?
I think it's neutral.
Okay.
I think either Monday or Friday because it allows me to travel on a weekend day, either way, to or fro. So if we do it on a Friday, I can go home on Saturday, like
Yeah.
this one, vice versa. If we do it on Monday, at least I can travel here on a Sunday.
Okay.
So either one would be fine.
Okay, any other board comments? Okay, well, there's a motion. Do we have a second for the motion? Okay, I'll second the motion. Can you call a vote?
Director Roberts. Yes. Director Kine.
Yes.
Director Gitlin.
Yes?
Vice Chair Fallon.
Yes. Okay, motion carries. On to item 6, or item 7, the 2018-19 RCTA Short Range Transit Plan presentation and discussion.
Thank you, Vice Chair Fallman. This
Thank you.
item's our main topic for today's meeting, and we're excited to welcome our consultant team that's been helping us craft the plan, no pun intended. So we have Ronnie Kraft here, who's our lead consultant. That one I didn't plan, it just slipped out. So Ronnie will be assisted in the presentation that they prepared for the board by Cliff Chambers. And these two have done a great job. They've been a real pleasure to work with. It's been very intense, especially the last couple of months, because the project's really come to a head. So you may recall they visited this board, although we have some new board members. So the first little bit's going to be review for Director Kime and Gitlin, who were here from the start. And then we'll go into phase 2, which is the new stuff, because phase 1 of the project was presented a few months ago. So we've been doing it in pieces, and now it's all coming together at the end into a single plan. So Ronnie, if you'd like to take it away.
Hi, all right. I'm Ronnie Kraft. I'm a transportation planner. And I'm going to walk you through this draft plan. And we have a lot to get through today. And so this is an overview of all of the different sections of my presentation. And so I'm going to open it up for questions at the end of each section. But if you could just please hold it until that moment. The Short Range Transit Plan is a blueprint for Redwood Coast Transit Service over the next 5 years. And so it covers fiscal year 1920 to 24-25. And so, yeah, as Joe said, we are here in August, and we held a workshop with the board on your priorities for RCTA's future. And so then in February, you saw the phase 1 report. And so I'm going to show some key highlights from that, but I'm really going to go past that since that's content you've already seen before. And then the phase 2 report is what I mainly want to focus on today. And so the items at the end are some of the most important, and so I'm going to try and keep that in mind and go a little bit faster at the beginning, just so you know.
Ronnie, if I could interrupt real briefly, does anyone have to leave early today? Is there any time constraints that we need to be aware of? Okay, okay. All right, Ronnie.
Okay.
Yeah, let's go fast through
Okay,
the first,
okay.
through the first
So,
part. Yeah.
phase 1 was the transit needs. It included a system overview, a public involvement, market research and transit needs summary, a discussion of the mission statement and some goals and performance standards, and then it also included the candidate service and capital improvements. But I'm not going to go over the last part because it'll be redundant. So for the system overview, it had these 4 sections, but again, I'm not going to go over the review of previous plans and studies or existing facilities because it's boring. And all right, so system overview, key highlights. Back here. So you have about 27,000 people in the county, and this population has been decreasing a little bit. But the Department of Finance predicts that the population is actually going to hold steady for the next 10 years. I wanted to point out, it's important to note that in that little pink area is 80% of the population of the county. That's about 6% of the land. The population of Crescent City, when I talk about it in the future, a lot of times does include about 2,700 inmates at Pelican Bay State Prison. There's an average population density of 372 people per mile in that little pink area, which is also, I'll call it the Crescent City County subdivision, or the Crescent City CCD. And then your county has a higher percentage than average of a Native American populations, and a lower than average for the state of Hispanic or Latino populations. And so focusing on populations that are more likely to be dependent on transit, we can start with older adults, and your county has a slightly higher proportion of older adults than the state does, and even about 16% in the Crescent City CCD. You have a really almost double the normal population of people who have a disability. A full 23% of people in your county have a disability, and 30% in the Crescent City area. When you look at older adults, the propensity for having a disability goes up 65 to 74, 45%, and then goes really high to 65% of people aged 75 and older report having a disability, and that's from the census. So people living in poverty are also more likely to be transit dependent. And the county also has a high percentage of people living in poverty compared to the rest of the state, 23%. And living in poverty is calculated in different ways, and it's dependent on household size and number of dependents and everything. And then, you know, this I wanted to point out, and I'll talk about this in just a bit, but there was an onboard survey done that was supporting this plan, and it showed that 72% of Redwood Coast passengers have an annual household income under $20,000. And that is less than the median household income. That's half of the median household income for the county. So this just really speaks to the importance of, you know, this population. And the unemployment's about 6%, and it's been steadily decreasing. So also likely to use transit are school-age kids, although that is not really the case as it stands right now for Redwood Coast Transit. Generally, middle school and early high school age kids are more likely to ride transit. You have about 2,600 youth aged 10 to 17 in the county, and 2,000 of those are in the Crescent City area. Part of the reason I think for this is that there is a super robust yellow bus school system, which I'm sure you guys all know about. But for students that live within 1.5 miles of the middle school and 2 miles from the high school, they're not eligible for the service. And so there's some opportunity that I'll discuss there. So in terms of travel behavior, 75% of your, or 74% drive alone to work, and a slightly higher amount carpool than the rest of California. Not a lot take transit, less than 1%. And you have a really high amount of people that are working in the county that also live here, 92%. 32% of your workers are leaving for work between 7 and 8 a.m. And your workers have a very short commute compared to the rest of California. 62% have a commute under 15 minutes, which is just fabulous, compared to only 22% for the rest of California. And so these are just maps showing key transit locations, and I just want to make the point here that Redwood Coast Transit does a pretty good job of serving these. You can see the dots pretty much align with the lines. And so I don't need to go over a whole lot in terms of transit. You know about Redwood Coast. It has a lot of connections to several regional operators. I do want to mention the Yurok Tribal Transit Service because this is going to come into play. They operate what is technically dial-a-ride, but it operates more as a commute type service. One of the things they provide, Monday to Friday, they do a run from Paymay to Crescent City in the morning and back, and then in the afternoon they do one from Paymay to Crescent City in the morning and back. And then they also provide dial-a-ride in the Klamath area, and non-emergency medical for Medi-Cal recipients, which I'll also get to. So, social service transportation, there is a senior center volunteer driver program, which is small, but it's great that it exists. Coastline takes people to dialysis 3 days a week, and there's a bunch of non-emergency medical transportation providers that are popping up and providing transportation for Medi-Cal recipients. And they're reporting increased ridership. So I just wanted to point out that a really good portion of the county's residents are eligible, are beneficiaries of Medi-Cal. And then the Social Service Transportation Advisory Council, the SSTAC, prioritizes unmet needs, unmet transit needs in the county once a year, and so I just hang on to that because I'm going to mention them again. So next I'm going to talk about the public involvement and the market research and the transit needs portion
Ron,
of this.
Can I just
Yeah.
interrupt you on that one point where you mentioned the Coastline, there's dialysis service 3 days a week. Was that to the new dialysis center, or do you know where this is?
All I know is it's a
Because
long trip.
I don't know when this report was, we've opened up a dialysis unit.
Yeah, I think that's news, and I'm sorry, we got together just before this, and we forgot to brief Ronnie and Cliff on that, but yeah, there's been a new emergent dialysis center that opened in the last month or so,
Yeah, I think this
here in
is-
town.
Okay, yeah, I think I spoke to them a little over a month ago, so.
Okay, and I
Yeah,
just
I
want to
don't
know
know.
that, is this on the dial-a-ride program, or is this as part of regularly scheduled route service?
A dial-a-ride, I believe.
It's
And
dial-a-ride.
Coastline would
Yeah,
be
they
like contract.
pick up, because it's dialysis
Okay,
patients, so they're
great.
pretty,
Thank you.
yeah. All right, so I'm going to give you some key highlights from this effort. There's two different inputs to this. First, there's a Dr. Shapiro report, which shouldn't be news to you guys, but he did an onboard survey, focus groups, interviews, and so that really fed into this plan, a lot of those findings. And then we did our site visit, our 3-day site visit, had a bunch of conversations with passengers on board the bus, we had a bunch of stakeholder interviews and meetings, held 2 community forums and spoke with passengers there, had a meeting with the bus operators, and then of course the board workshop. So for the onboard survey, all of the routes were surveyed, and the 149 back, which is a pretty good percentage. You can see that there's a relatively low population of youth ridership compared to, what the proportions are for the rest of the county and for the city. And there's also just a higher proportion of people aged 45 plus riding the bus than, you would expect for the county proportions. And so passengers are also low income, as I mentioned. And then 63% are female. And people are generally pretty pleased with Redwood Coast Transit's giving a 5.5 out of 7, saying that it meets my transit needs. And then they asked passengers what their top 3 needed improvements would be, and the top 3 were Sunday service, having service later in the PM, and then better Saturday service. So from the stakeholder interviews and the board workshop, we found that some top themes that came out were the need for increased bus shelters, and maintaining existing shelters and providing route schedule and information at key stops. And this, as you know, is in process by Joe and others. The implementing technological solutions was a key theme, various solutions, and that is also in progress. More marketing in progress, specifically to foreign travelers. And then maintaining existing levels of service. We found that a lot of people had mentioned that current riders are pleased with the service and also very dependent on Redwood Coast Transit. Increasing student ridership was a key theme, and then as was non-emergency medical transportation. And I do want to point out that in my research, when I said that there's a bunch of services popping up, I think this is I got the impression this is a relatively new thing, and that this need might have been at least partially fulfilled by now. So.
Hi, I'm Cliff Chambers, and working with Ronnie on this. Last August, we brought before you several options for a mission statement, and there was a decision at the time to have a broad approach. So the mission statement that you wanted us to carry forward is this: to provide safe and cost-effective local and regional public transportation services, to provide a mobility option for Del Norte County residents, students, employees, and visitors to the area. So, and you also instructed us to use our professional judgment, working with Joe to come up with the goals and performance standards that you could use for regularly monitoring the performance. And we've done so, and the details are in the report. I'll just do a kind of a high-level summary. For each of the performance standards, we've set a minimum performance standard that you shouldn't really go below, and we've also set a target, an aspirational standard that you really should work for. So we're just going to quickly go through the goals. We have a service effectiveness goal to provide an effective level of service in response to demonstrated community market needs. And the standard is really in terms of how many passengers per hour that you have on the bus for different types of services, which is spelled out below. The second one is really what we call the cost efficiency goal, and it's self-explanatory that you have financially sustainable services and that you keep your costs in control. And those performance standards are operating cost per vehicle service hour, the fare box ratio, recovery ratio, and the cost per passenger trip. So for example, in terms of cost efficiency, we presented last time how you compare to other peer agencies, and you are definitely at, at the time it was 63.21 per hour, and you can see that there are several of the agencies that are over $100 an hour. So in terms of, we want to certainly have a target of $70 per hour, but a minimum standard of 77, and those would be adjusted 5% per year. And then the fare box recovery ratio, in 14-15, your fare box recovery ratio was 18.2%, and it has dropped down to 11.4%. And we have set a minimum target of 10%, which is required by state law, but a target standard of 14%. The good news is that the LC top monies that you're receiving for a free fare program, those can be counted towards the fare box recovery ratio. So you have a much better chance of staying above the 10% figure than without the LC top money. So that's a good news thing. The goal 3 is essentially a service quality goal, which is making sure that the services are reliable and convenient for the passengers. So we have things like, with the new technology with double map and the real-time information, we'll be able to monitor how often the buses are on time and regularly report this. So a lot of these things are going to be included when Joe does the annual report. You'll be able to see where these performance standards lie in terms of meeting those goals. And then finally, the goal 4 is to provide safe and convenient transportation services to residents and visitors of Del Norte County, and that's things like the span of service and the miles between preventable accidents. So I'm going to turn it back to Ronnie to talk now about phase 2.
All right. Phase 2 includes these chapters. Oh, was there any questions on the previous part? Okay. So for the performance data management and collection, this is a pretty rosy chapter because there's a lot being done to improve it right now. And it's really great, and it's going to improve so many aspects of, I think, Joe's life and service in general. This chapter looks at what the current process is for the collection and management of the performance data that Cliff was just talking about, what the planned improvements are, and then it recommends a few more potential actions. So currently, you have your Google Transit feed, and then there's TripMaster, which manages the dial-a-ride system, and then there's an automatic vehicle location system called GeoTabs. So building on that, there's some really exciting work going on with implementation of double map and using mobile tablets on board the fixed route buses. It uses the current AVL system. The system can be monitored remotely, which is very important given your management model. There's very robust reporting availability, and including on-time performance. There's a dashboard that you can see a whole bunch of metrics all at once. You can reports for all of the performance data that we just talked about. It integrates with TripMaster, Token Transit, and any other systems that want to talk with it. It can provide real-time passenger information and through the mobile app. So really great stuff going on. Just a few potential improvements just to make sure that that integration happens with TripMaster and other inputs. That's super important so that you have an accurate picture of the whole system. And then there's opportunities to look at the way that customer complaints are tracked and potentially move to a more electronic system or database system, as well as road calls and accidents. So back to Cliff.
Okay. Part of our scope of work is to really look at the management structure and determine whether there are sufficient management resources to do the job. So what we really decided to do is to do a peer analysis of other agencies, and particularly because you have a remote part-time lean management service. And so I think the focus for us in general was to look at it, but during this contract for the short-range transit plan, you've extended the contract for another 2 years. You've added the marketing and ad revenue for $10,000 per year, and the CTSA is certainly something that we're going to be discussing, and assuming that you do go forward with it, Heron and TMTP will have a role in that. So a lot of additional resources have already been added, and we wanted to look at what that really means with the peers. So we looked at 7 peers that were rural transit systems, basically similar geography, size. Some of them had more service hours. And the metric that we really wanted to compare to kind of normalize the data was the full-time equivalents per 10,000 hours of operation. And so we conducted phone interviews, talked to each of the agencies to gather that information. And so, let's see here. So, and these kind of list, you know, there's a lot of different flavors in terms of how rural transit systems are organized.
Chris, could I just interrupt you a second? You mentioned the figure 10,000 hours. I'm trying to figure out there's 7,500 hours in a year. Now, is this
The
composite
10,000, I'm sorry, I didn't make myself clear. 10,000 hours of operations of service. So you operate around 17,000 hours of service annually.
Okay.
So it's per, to normalize it, it's per, the full-time equivalents per 10,000 hours of operation.
So you're saying there's full, complete maintenance every 3/4 of a year? Is that what I'm?
No, I'm saying, how many full-time equivalents of a staff person? So you have, as you'll see in the next slide here, you right now, with the contract that you have a total of 0.45 staff people with Heron TMTP,
Okay.
and you
I
operate
understand.
17,000 vehicle service hours, so the full-time equivalent per 10,000 is 0.26.
Okay.
That's what I'm talking about.
The numbers are a little boggling when I'm hearing them. Now that you put the post up here, I can see it in living color. So-
That's why I went forward, because I can see there was confusion, okay? So I was going to get to that. But I think I'll just stay with this slide, because I think this is the most important slide to kind of really show you how we kind of calculate these figures, and we collected this information for others. So right now, at the end of fiscal year 17-18, I just said there was 0.26 FTEs per 10,000 hours. And as you add some of the things like the marketing and the CTSA, that will go up to 0.32. But we wanted to compare that with what other rural agencies had, and that's on the next slide here. So this is again comparing in 17-18, because that's where we had the data. You were at 0.26. And I've done work for all of these agencies except Siskiyou Transit, and I know all about them. But regardless, the staffing levels are for comparison. So for example, the Reading Area Bus Authority has 2.2 full-time equivalents, but they operate a lot more service. And so the equivalency is 0.37 per 10,000 hours of service that is operated. And they're the closest to you. Humboldt Transit Authority, down the road, has 0.43.
Chris?
Cliff,
I'm looking at your chart. The closest to Redwood Coast Transit would be Siskiyou Transit, the list on total service miles. Is that what I'm looking at?
The
Redwood Coast Transit, 17.
closest in the number of hours is, so they have less hours, but have staffing of 1.35 full-time equivalents. So they have more than one person working on this, and a third person working in transit for the 15,000 vehicle service hours. The 1 hour operating a bus on the road is the 15,000 hours, and they have 0.86 full-time equivalents per 10,000 hours. So that will makes it so you can
3.5 times greater.
Pardon?
3.5 times greater, 0.26, 0.86.
Yes. They have 3 times greater staffing than you have
Okay.
for that same amount. Now,
I'm trying to get a picture, and I don't mean to interrupt you, I'm trying to get a picture to compare these numbers, which can be a little mind-boggling if you're looking at them for the first time, as I'm seeing here. I'm trying to get a picture of what satisfies this area so we're more in line with what other services are doing. The rhetorical question comes up, so are we understaffed? I guess that would be my first question. And if we are, should that be addressed not at this meeting, but at a future meeting?
Yeah.
That's what
Well, I think, you know, the conclusion that we came is that, you know, ultimately, and what we're going to be recommending in a couple slides here is that so the closest in terms of, because you have contract management and contract services, which is very unusual in California. The one that's really closest to you in terms of management structure is Lake Transit, where the former transit manager, Mark Wall, actually did work at Lake Transit, and they have .54, and the .43 to .54, I think, is in the general area of where you should be in order to carry out all the different duties that have to be carried out. And so what we're recommending is when you renew the contract, whoever gets that contract, that it's at .4, and then the next time you get it up to .5, and I think that would be sufficient staffing. Now, you can make other consideration, but there's been a lot of things that haven't been adequately addressed that you've taken steps to address, things like the marketing program, which is really good, but there's also, you know, the bus shelter improvements. There's really not a lot of staff time to do those kind of things. There's really not the staff time right now to do a lot of the monitoring of the contractor, and we have a whole list in here of other kinds of things. So that is essentially the conclusion. So I've already going 2 steps beyond here in terms of the recommendation is this on the side, is at the end of the contract in 2023 that you go to the .4, and then it would add $22,275 to additional contract, and after that you go to .5. And so some of the additional duties that would be are listed here. So I know the bus shelter replacement program is really important. It does need staffing to do it, and it can be very time consuming. The whole free fare program, you just can't put free fares out. You really need to do the marketing, you need to make the arrangements, you need to do a lot of stuff that go with that to really build the ridership. You need a lot of time for those kind of things to really build ridership. And part of that is the potential partnerships and the existing partnerships that you have, you need to foster. And you need more on-site time to do those kinds of things. And that's what we're really suggesting, is that when he comes up here, he can't just spend a day. He really needs to be spending 2 days, and he needs to really spend the time to do the additional partnership building, the marketing, you know, all the other administrative things that you need to do on site, like the bus shelters, making sure, you know, that you're working with the city, the county, whoever it is, to be able to do those kinds of things, and those kind of things. And I think with that, you're going to have, you know, better adequate staffing. So hopefully that answers your question.
Jump in that in the interviews, unprompted, 2 of the agencies said that they were understaffed. Even they're above.
Yeah.
2 of the other agencies that are on this list, Siskiyou, also stated that they're understaffed, but this
You're still
Redwood Coast
lowest.
Transit Authority seems to have the very lowest level of threshold.
Yeah.
So are you adding we are really understaffed? Is that what I'm hearing, that this is an area, even though 2 of those agencies, which have a much higher FTE to hours allocated, they're up in the ones and higher percentages, in one of them was 2.25. I think that was
Right. And those are a little bit skewed, I think, because their service miles are under 10,000. Service hours are under 10,000, so it multiplied. Portion.
But I think, you know, it goes to show in terms of the job that Joe and Dan have been doing, that they've been doing a lot for the amount of time and resources that have been allocated. The thing is that it can only last for so long, and you're not going to see the kinds of things done that you need to do, and particularly paying attention to getting the ridership trend back up. And it has, because there's been some investment recently in marketing, a free fare program, but those kinds of things take time and energy and resources to make happen to achieve your overall goals. And I think you're understaffed right now to basically achieve your mission statement and the goals that I outlined before. I mean, that's the bottom line. Okay? Sobering. Is there any other questions about that before we go on? Nope. Okay. All right. So we're going to turn the page here, and we're going to talk about recommended service actions. But before we do that, we really did, in terms of the when we looked at the various potential improvements and potential service cutbacks that could be made over time, we really wanted to base that on the market research that we did in terms of riding the buses, looking at the Shapiro market research report, and all those kinds of things. Now, the fact of the matter is, when you look at it financially, Redwood Coast Transit Authority has gone through some pretty wide fluctuations of an available funding. We had cutbacks in the federal funding that provides funding for the intercity services from here to Arcata, as an example, was $300,000, and it got reduced down to $125,000. And it's gone back up some, but it's still not where it was. And there's been other fluctuations in what we call, as part of the Transportation Development Act funding, state transit assistance. It's gone up, it's gone down. And there still is a lot of uncertainty in funding that California transit agencies, and particularly rural agencies, do. So you have to put this in context of improvements, because in order to make improvements, you want to make sure that it's financially sustainable, and that you build enough reserves so that when you have some of those fluctuations, you don't have to cut service. So when you had to cut Saturday service, as an example, or you had to eliminate Route 10, there were some reasons for doing that, but it did cause, when we were talking to passengers, particularly like the Saturday service, it doesn't work really well, and so it impacts people's lives that don't have cars in terms of their mobility options. So that gives you an overall context of what we were doing, looking at the actions. But we looked at a wide range of things, and this table is a little hard to read, but we looked at weekend service, we looked at the special school tripper services, what it would cost to add. We looked at providing one of the things from the passengers where they want later evening service and Sunday service. We wanted particularly when we did the interviews with the board, you wanted to look at some of the tourist options for providing services to make it more attractive to tourists. We looked at those. And then better service is down to Klamath and Klamath Glen. And we looked at an array of different options to provide that service. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about my perceptions of the Saturday service. It was reduced to one bus on Saturdays, and when you really look at, that you really reduced it to routes 2 and 4. People can't get to places they need to go to within Crescent City on that route. It's really long one-way loop with one bus instead of 2 buses operating. There's no service on Northcrest Drive, and all the results that we got from the Shapiro report are, looking at the onboard survey, the comment cards, and people, it's not working. So I think it's relatively inexpensive to restore that service, and I think you should really, it's recommended that you do restore it. And any other types of improvements that you do make, you need to really look carefully at it and ask yourself, is this really financially sustainable? So let me give you an example of one that's not financially sustainable. And it was the top improvement from passengers that they really would like to have Sunday service. Well, ridership is much lower on Sundays because a lot of services are not there, and it's usually about 30 to 40% of the ridership that you would get on a regular weekday. And so when you look at it, it's just not very cost effective, it's not very cost efficient, it really drags down your fare box recovery ratio, and ultimately the benefit cost ratio is really poor. The benefits of additional ridership and mobility needs is really poor compared to the overall cost. So that just gives you 2 examples, and I'm going to have Ronnie go ahead and complete the rest. Thanks.
All right, moving on to increasing student ridership. I looked at a few options for this. So there's been a lot of recent progress. The College of the Redwoods and Humboldt State University Free Fare Program has resulted in increased ridership among those sects, as you can see in the graph on the right. You guys are starting the high school free fare program, which is wonderful, and you've done the associated coordination and marketing, and we'll be doing that with the high schools. And so this has really resulted in some increased ridership, which is great. You know, as I mentioned, there's this school district yellow bus, and this gives you a visual representation of what those service areas are where they do not provide service. So as you can see, it's, you know, pretty much most of the Crescent City area. The school bus does serve 60% of their students, and it's free to students, and most of their students, and that's because most of their students are low income. So looking at Redwood Coast Transit Service, you know, here's, oh, I also want to point out, those are all little multifamily housing, is where the little house symbols are. So that'll come to play. You know, it's really difficult to serve schools, especially when they have early out Wednesdays and minimum days with Redwood Coast Transit, but there is some alignment with Redwood Coast Transit schedules and bell times, and then there's also some not. And also they have a free breakfast program that starts at 7:30. And so some alternatives for increasing student ridership are to do a potential summer youth pass. This could benefit students in getting them used to riding the bus, but in a less stressful environment of having to get to school. So if you implemented this summer, it would get students, you know, wrapping their head around the idea of maybe riding Redwood Coast Transit, and it would be free or very, very discounted. And so that's one alternative. The second is to increase ridership on existing services by adjusting the schedule slightly and by doing route deviations where the route would go a little bit closer to the school or to the schools to drop students and pick up students there. And I forgot to mention that because you guys are already serving the colleges and have increased ridership, this is really focusing on the middle school and high school, but with the high school as sort of phase one primary, and then looking at the middle school second. And so Joe and I have come up with a pretty detailed recommendation for improving the schedule as it is now, making slight modifications so that you can drop students from different areas within the city to the school, to the high schools on time, and then looking at middle school, sort of secondary. And then the third option is to look at what's called a school tripper. This is pretty common, especially for rural or smaller transit agencies, or to provide special trips that specifically are aimed to getting students to and from the schools. They, you know, legally have to be open to the public, but a lot of times they're just chock full of students. The suggestion here would be to serve those multifamily housing areas that are not served by yellow bus service. You guys have varying weather conditions. You know, we heard from the school that, you know, it's just because a kid is 3/4 of a mile away or half a mile away doesn't mean they always want to walk in the rain and the wind and cold. And so this tripper, what seems feasible would be to do one trip in the morning and 2 trips in the evening, or in the PM, since the schools get out at different times, but they start at the same time. So this is just sort of a rough mock-up of what a morning route could look like. You know, picking up students at the apartments, Hidden Creek, and maybe the mobile home park in Pine Grove, and then Seaside Village, and then dropping those students off at the high school, and then hitting some more apartment buildings throughout town and down in the downtown area, dropping students off at the middle school, and then whoever got on after the high school could go and be dropped off back up at the high school. It's just a rough sketch, but it shows that it could be feasible. And so for recommendations for increasing student ridership, phase one, which would be, this year or soon, would be, again, that summer youth pass, doing the cost-neutral schedule adjustments and route deviations that we came up with, and prioritizing the high school, coordinating with the school district on doing a needs analysis for future improvements, possibly a tripper, but also to coordinate with them on doing intensive marketing and maybe some service evaluation. You could do a focus group with high school students to see how it's going thus far. And then also school-based transit maps are always helpful to show both parents and students in a more focused manner when bell time, when the bus is coming compared to school bell times. And so phase two, recommendations are to extend the free fare program to the middle school, and then look at maybe schedule adjustments and route deviations that are not cost neutral but are still low cost. For instance, you could adjust the start location and time of a morning route so that it picked up students before going to the cultural center, like say in the downtown or in the northeast portion of the city. And then look at a school tripper if it's deemed feasible and if there's demand. And then explore past sales at the schools in the event that the fare programs are discontinued. And so, adjusting the start location and times is very low cost. The school tripper service is relatively low cost, around $20,000. So this alternative is looking at providing later evening service, and this came up since it was one of the top improvements asked for by passengers in the onboard survey. And so, currently local routes end around 6:25 or 7, and 199 ends around 5:30, and Route 20 ends around 8:20. And so just to give some history, you had a round of cuts in July 2017 that reduced service by 30 minutes on all routes, and then also reduced 90 minutes of dispatch support. And then in July 2018, the late night Route 20 trip was moved to the midday. And all of these were made due to budget constraints and the low ridership on those trips. And I should mention that the reduction in the 90 minutes of dispatch support resulted in that there's bus operators coming back that are not able to be checked in by a person. And so, a lot of people work later than 5:30, so that's one of the reasons this came up. And also in discussions with passengers on the board the bus, this came up. So one option is to add 1 hour service on local routes, but this is another one that we're not actually recommending because it's not quite feasible. They're already low ridership, not a lot of return for the money that it would cost. But there is also the recommendation to add 90 minutes back of dispatch support. And there's reasons for this, but it was negotiated at $1,000 a month previous reduction, so it would cost $12,000 to put it back in. All right. 90 minutes, right? Yep. 90 minutes of dispatch support. So, looking at pilot projects to attract more tourists on Redwood Coast Transit buses. You guys serve some great state and national parks, but there's not, a lot of designated stops and not much information at them about Redwood Coast Transit Service. And there is a new tourist destination map in progress. Excited to see that. And so for market research, the Dr. Shapiro report had a lot to say about, potential tourist ridership. There's a lot of foreign independent travelers, which are a potential market, but they do tend to have higher standards for transit service. Many people arrive by car, and so having the transit information out there in advance is important if you want to actually get people to get out of their cars for day trips. And then key lodgings along, in Crescent City and along the Redwood Coast Highway don't have stops, designated stops, and there are hotels that are willing to post Redwood Coast Transit information, and this is something that's actively being pursued. So this is looking at 4 alternatives. The first one is to establish key stops at tourist locations. As I said, this is in progress, and this is really more of a capital expenditure, so it's talked about in the capital portion of the plan. And then another alternative is to look at extending Route 199 south and to add stops to key lodgings along Redwood High during peak tourist season, because currently it stops at the cultural center. And then the third is to look at adding a PM trip to 199 during tourist season so that people have a second option for returning back. And then the fourth is looking at adding stops on Route 20 at key tourist lodgings, which could be the same ones, or probably would be the same ones as the ones for 199. And so, but this would add time. So to show you the costs, alternative number 2 would cost about $10,000 to add those stops. And that's just an extension of the route, what that would cost. Adding a PM trip would cost about $8,000. Adding stops on Route 20 at key tourist lodgings, this is accounting for the extra running time, and it'd be about $16,000. So, I know you guys are going to have lots of questions, but I can backtrack when we get to them. So this last one is looking at morning service from Klamath to Crescent City. We heard a lot about the need for this at the public workshops that we held, and we also got some comment cards back about it. So again, Yurok Tribal Transit Service operates that morning and afternoon service from Pei to Crescent City, and so what we heard is from Klamath Glen riders that is beyond Pei, that they're not being served by Yurok Tribal Transit Service to get into Crescent City. Because apparently, and this is reported by YTTS also, that you need at least 3 riders for them to do what's essentially a special pickup, meaning pickup beyond Pei. And then they also reported that there is demand, or they've been hearing that there's could be demand for a second morning trip, because right now they leave Pei at 6:50 a.m., which is pretty early. So if someone has a doctor's appointment midday, a second morning trip would be more beneficial. And so we looked at sort of 2 alternatives. One is to subsidize the cost of the extension to Klamath Glen, and those are both relatively low cost. And then the second, and you could do that 3 or 5 days a week. And then the other alternative is to provide that second morning trip on YTTS, but in coordination. And again, could be 3 or 5 days per week. The number 1 recommendation on this, before we really get into costs or how this would look, is to coordinate with YTTS. And they are willing to coordinate. And so we really need to conduct a needs analysis, especially regarding service from Klamath Glen, and that's actually wouldn't be that difficult to do. It's a very small community, so you could actually even just, put a survey on everyone's door, do something like that, talk to people. And also looking for and working with YTTS to see if there's demand for a second morning trip. There's definite cost sharing potential for improvements, and then also potential to coordinate with the Medi-Cal service that they provide. So subsidization, depending on how you look at it, costs anywhere from $1,300 to $6,500. And then adding YTS morning trip would cost between $7,800 and $1,300, depending on if you did it 3 to 5 days per week. But that's total cost. That's not saying that would be cost to Redwood Coast Transit or YTTS. It really would need to be worked out. So main recommendation on this is start working with them. And so, well, wait, any questions on those improvements? I know it's a lot that I'm throwing at you, and it's all in the report. Okay, so speaking to what Cliff said about the unstable financial history of Redwood Coast Transit. We felt like it was important to also look at what you could do to reduce service in the event that, A, you wanted to make an improvement that you felt was important and you wanted to remain cost neutral, or in the event that, funding is reduced and you need to look at where you can cut service. And so I'm not going to go into each of these in detail, but I just wanted to show you that there is a breadth, and there is, small services, and small cuts, and then there are large cuts, anything from, taking out Saturday service altogether, taking out Saturday service in certain routes, taking out certain trips, replacing with general public dial ride on Saturdays. And so these are all cost savings potentials, and they're just explained in the report. That is it for the recommended services actions chapter. Is there anything on that? Okay, great, we're trucking along. Okay, so Consolidated Transportation Services Agency. This is a chapter in here. It's an implementation plan, and this is a chapter in here because you guys have already approved Redwood Coast Transit to be the designated CTSA for the county in the next fiscal year. So this year, we're looking at planning 2 programs that you already approved, a travel training program and an ADA eligibility certification program. So the purpose of CTSAs is they generally coordinate transportation services, including social service transportation. They provide public information about a variety of transportation options, provide technical assistance in some cases, and the target markets are older adults, people with disabilities, and people with low income, but it can be wider than that. And so this report provides a pretty detailed implementation plan for these 2 services, but it also looks at potential other programs that would be feasible for Redwood Coast. So the 2 programs are travel training and the ADA eligibility process. For travel training, this is where you have people that train others to ride fixed route transit, and this generally results in increased ridership because you're helping people who might otherwise be hesitant about riding transit. And it's usually, it takes a variety of forms, but a very effective form is doing it in person, taking a ride with people. This is the second highest need identified by the SS TAC, unmet need identified by the SS TAC, several years in a row. And it often results in increased independence for people with disabilities and lower reliance on dial-a-ride. And so for the ADA eligibility process, I'm going to let Cliff describe that and just go into the travel training program recommendations. We're recommending, after looking at a variety of models, what would be most feasible and best for Redwood Coast Transit and for the community is to have Redwood Coast Transit operators trained to be travel trainers. They're already familiar with the system, intimately familiar, and they're already familiar with passenger needs. We're recommending oversight by the general manager of the program, recruiting trainees through coordination with the senior center and other local organizations. Another great source for trainees is an ADA eligibility process. And you should conduct pre-training interviews and have waivers. We're recommending that you guys use a software program to manage both programs. It could be really helpful for managing trainees and their progress and keeping track of outreach. And then you can also use it to train people in the field using mobile pads that assist with the training, things to check off and keeping track of everything. So for ADA eligibility process, here's Cliff. Or you can go straight to it.
I wanted to do a time check before we go on, because I know, remember, Kym said she needed to leave, and the last section is on the financial part, so I've got about 5 minutes to go through this CTSA eligibility thing, and then another 5 minutes for the marketing plan. You can, okay. Okay, I just wanted to make sure, because if we were going to do that, I was going to go right into the financial stuff. Because ultimately, the financial plan is probably the most important part of a short-range transit plan, because it really provides a financial framework for you for making sure that services are sustainable and that you can afford to pay for replacing buses, for example. So, all right, I'm just going to talk about the ADA eligibility process. When the Americans with Disabilities Act was approved and the implementation regulations went forward, it had basically complimentary paratransit service for those individuals who can't, navigate the bus for fixed route transit. And it requires that you have a structured process for determining eligibilities for ADA. And so we went through and wanted to make sure that you meet the best practices. And there has been people who are, say they're disabled, but they're really not under those guidelines. And so there's some, potential fraud. We haven't verified that, but there's at least hypothesis that that's happening. You're not getting the fares that you should. And the whole program really can be synergistic with travel training, because it's much more cost effective to take a trip on the fixed route bus than be picked up on dial-a-ride and transported. It's typically, 2 or 3 times cheaper on a fixed route bus than it is on a dial-a-ride bus. Okay. So the regulations, I'm not going to get into the details other than say that we've provided a framework in this plan for an ADA eligibility determination process, but there is a required public involvement process, and there are guidelines, very strict guidelines. As somebody applies for ADA eligibility, it has to be processed, and there has to be within 21 days. And there needs to be an appeals process, because it is a civil rights legislation. If we deny eligibility, then they have a right for due process to appeal and do that. So we've set the whole framework, but I have to stress that it does need to go out to public involvement process, which you've recommended, and then there might be some changes to that after you go through that process. But there's essentially 3 categories of eligibility: unconditional, conditional, and then temporary. So if I break my ankle and I'm unable to drive, I'm eligible temporarily because I can't navigate to a bus stop, as an example, a simple example. And there are requirements for allowing personal attendants on the bus, for companions. And right now, because you have a general public dial-a-ride that exceeds the American with Disabilities Act requirements, there's not much that you really need to do except in terms of visitors. So if you have an individual here who is ADA eligible, because right now we're not providing the eligibility card to that individual, when they go down to Eureka, they don't have their eligibility card, so they can't travel around other places around the United States. Like, people would come here, have been certified, they have a card that says that you're eligible, and that's part of this legislation that allows people to have mobility across other areas. So there does need to be the determination process. It's not happening right now. So as Ronnie mentioned, there's a tool that really would help this process, particularly when you have general manager from remotely working with the operator. We go into a lot of detail about this in that chapter, but I'll just say that really the division of labor is such that First Transit would handle like the phone call inquiries, they would handle receiving the paper applications, doing the data entry for those, and then turn it over to Heron TMTP to actually make the eligibility determination. And that's the basic division of responsibilities. then they turn it back over to First Transit to do the more kind of clerical end. You know, we want a photo ID as part of their certification card, and then if there is an appeal, if there is a denial of their eligibility, that Heron TMP would actually, process the appeals, and we go into in the report how the appeals process would work in detail. But what we've suggested overall is the most cost-effective way for you to do this. We looked at 3 different organizational options and had a lot of discussions with Joe about this, and I think we've come up with something that would be very cost-effective and work. Is there any questions about this? Because this is an important part of this process. Okay? All right. I'm going to get into a little bit more fun stuff, which is the marketing plan. So the basic goal of a marketing effort is to build ridership. That's the bottom line, is you want to build and maintain ridership. So in part of doing that, we have 4 specific goals for marketing. That's build visibility and build awareness of the system, and then basically enhance use of the system and build, so people know that it's not only for those people, it's potentially, if you may have to use it at some point, your car breaks down, that you can use it and it's not that difficult. That really creating marketing partnerships with community organizations, and the time for that is really important, and to really promote trial ridership among high potential, riders. So, for example, Ronnie talked earlier about the whole tourist and the foreign independent traveler that comes here. They expect to have, they expect to have ability to use transit to get to the tourist destinations. That's what they expect. Right now, it's not really set up to do that. And so I think, marketing and better public information on the website, in information, and the kind of, promoting, if you decide to go forward with some of the service improvements, serving some of the hotel destinations on like Route 199 during the summer, you need to be able to market it so people know in advance, before they book their trip to come see these glorious redwoods, that they can use the bus to get there, and they have a stop that they know that another bus is going to come by and take them back to the hotel. It's very simple kinds of things like that that are really important in terms of, we call marketing, but a lot of it is just good public communication of the services that you have available. So there's various target markets. I just talked about the tourism, the intercounty travelers. You've done a great job with, I think, beginning the process of building ridership with the college students. I think there's a lot of opportunity for the free fare program for the high school and middle school, but that's just not going to happen. You need to let people know that this is going on. You need to promote it. I think some of even the school tripper kind of ideas are really going to benefit lower income. It's going to be free, so people are going to have options right now that it's, and I think those are the kinds of things that you want to do. We have an aging population, and people want to know, when my driver's license is taken away or I can no longer drive, do I have an option to get to point A to point B? Again, there needs to be communication and outreach that happen along with that. And part of it is just raising the image of transit, and part of that can really be done by good branding of the buses. So what we're recommending in this plan is, as you purchase buses, that you hire a graphic artist. These designs on the right are just 2 samples of the way buses can look. Instead of having just a white bus, it just doesn't grab you. And so I think when you purchase new buses, that you can really jazz them up and build up and brand the image of Redwood Coast Transit a little bit more. And I think there's some exciting possibilities for that. And then in terms of passenger information, there's a couple samples in terms of the website. Trinity Transit, where I'm actually doing work right now, has this wonderful website. You go to it, you know exactly. And it's very similar. They have longer distance routes, but you just, right on the front page, you can see the route and the schedule that you want to get is right there. It's very easy. You have a trip planner as part of it, and you do have a trip planner, but if it's really integrated well, it's just pleasing. And if you're a tourist, you can go right to the page, and you're able to get there. So there's been a lot of good things that happen with the website, but there's some upgrades that could even improve it more. And then another big part is just at the bus stop itself with the shelters, having some information about the system, not just blank shelters. And it takes some work because you need to maintain those in terms of information. But even at the bus stop, this is just an example of what can be done with a little, display in terms of the bus stops here, and the bus comes here at 20 after the hour, or 8:20 and 10:40, whatever it is, so people know what's going on at that particular bus stop, and it gives good information. And you would have information that people could call, or a website, they can get more information. There's just a lot of simple things that can be done that we are recommending as part of this in the marketing plan. And then, community information, for example, at the college, et cetera, just having freestanding displays where people can get information about the services, just simple card holders, which, the nice thing about this particular plan is, as we've discussed these things, Joe has begun to implement them. So he's going out, I think tomorrow, and he's got these information displays with the information on the Redwood Coast Transit Services, and these kind of display racks, and they're actually doing it at various, I think you said 20 different locations. So those things are happening already as we've kind of talked through some of these things, and you've given them money to be able to do this as part of the 10,000 advertising revenue. So those things, a lot of these things are actually beginning to take place already. And then there's just system-wide promotion. And I've really talked a lot about these things, but there's nothing more powerful than like testimonial campaigns in the local newspaper that, you're a senior and you're able to use the bus to get from point A to point B in their own words with their own pictures. People recognize who it is. Those are simple kinds of things that you can do in terms of then working with gatekeepers. When we did our interviews, there is good knowledge about the system, but I think building those relationships even more and working with them for the clients and the case managers that work with a lot of the transit-dependent population will be even more effective. And the same thing happens with just the tourist industry. This just doesn't happen. There needs to be building those relationships. Is there any questions about the marketing plan before I go on? Okay, good. All right. So you have a handout on the financial plan, okay? And it's a lot of numbers, and I'm not going to go through all the numbers. I'm going to just talk about some of the really important things in here. I've talked so far about the changing environment on the revenues, but I want to talk a little bit now about the changes in costs and what the major trends are. So the bottom line in all these numbers that is on this first page is that costs are really increasing at a much higher rate than inflation, and you're adding about $70,000 a year in costs. And the other part of this at the very bottom of the page is that Joe's done a very good job of beginning to build an operating reserve fund balance, and it was about almost $350,000. Our recommendation when you do this all over the place is that you have at least a half a year of budget in reserve so that when you have these kind of funding fluctuations that you don't have to just immediately cut half of Saturday service, for example. That you have enough reserves that you can work through those down cycles so that you don't have to cut service. And that's a main reason for having those kinds of reserves. So we purposely intend at the very bottom to build that up from $350,000 to almost, a little over $750,000 by the end of the period of time. Now, these are just projections, and we can't predict exactly what's going to happen in the future, and funding fluctuations, again, may not allow some of that to happen, but it's possible and hopeful, and that's what we'd like to happen. And these are reasonable assumptions on costs. But let me go into some of the line items here that are particularly important that we've already talked about. So the management contract, again, if you decide after 2021 to implement the recommendation to getting up to from the 0.26 to the 0.40 FTEs per 10,000 vehicle service hours, as an example, it would cost another $22,000 to do that a year, and that's added here. The marketing, the $10,000 is part of the contract, which just assume is straight across. It keeps it that. That could change. That's really up to you. We've added in the costs of the CTSA, both the travel training and ADA certification. So it costs during the startup first year about $15,450, and then it declines after you pay for the startup cost. And then if you have, so the CTSA money comes from the Transportation Development Act, which is the quarter-cent sales tax, and the Del Norte Local Transportation Commission can allocate up to 5% for the purposes of this kind of the CTSA. So it's really at their discretion in terms of how much is given, but if in the chapter on the CTSA, there's other types of activities besides the travel training and the ADA eligibility determination that could take place. And if you decide to do that, then this budget includes some other line items for those costs that would be eligible for CTSA funding. Let me now turn to the operations and maintenance contract, which you have a current contract for, and this plan assumes that you take advantage of the 2 option years, and then the last year we just inflate it on an average rate. But it's already built in what the annual variable costs are per contract, as are the annual fixed costs and insurance. Those are already known. It's just the variable costs are dependent on the number of vehicle service hours that you're actually providing. So what this plan assumes is that you go forward with the Saturday improvements, that you implement the school tripper service, but it doesn't include any other of the service improvements that we've talked about. Those are decisions that you'll have to make in terms of trading off, because I think where we have it right now is financially sustainable. If you want to add, subtract, something has to, if you want to add something, you probably have to subtract something. Or you have to take a risk that it's not, if you feel that it's financially sustainable, that's a judgment call over time because of the funding fluctuations that we have. So the other thing that we're here is, and I haven't had a chance to talk to you yet, I will a little bit, is there wasn't the data and it wasn't part of our scope to do a detailed fare analysis. We really feel you should it's a very complex fare system that you have right now for such a small system. We really think it needs to be looked at comprehensively, start with a blank slate, and really re-look at the whole fare structure. So we're allocating $20,000 for a fare study in fiscal year 2021. And then the state has come up with regulations for zero-emission buses that won't take effect fully until after the planning horizon for this study, but they do require that you have a zero-emission rollout plan, and so we've allocated some money for that study, essentially going eventually to electric buses is what the state is requiring. And then we've added in advertising, marketing, and printing. And so essentially the bottom line is we go from an anticipated $1.2 million in 18-19 for operating expenses, and it grows to about $1.58 million in 2023-24. Any question about operating expenses?
One quick one about gas. So, I mean, if we're considering adding more routes and using the buses more frequently, then how is it that you project over the next few years that or fuel costs are going to decline?
Well, so I used the budgeted number in 1819, but when we really looked at it, it was 136,000, and then you can see it does grow substantially from 1920 to 23, 24.
Yeah.
So what Joe did in 1819, because we didn't know what the fuel prices would be, he jacked it up higher than it probably needed to be.
I see, okay. So it's a difference between
Yeah.
budgeted to actual.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Is that correct, Joe?
Well, it is correct, and it also shines a light on what Cliff just mentioned, that there's very little service expansion in the plan.
Right.
So we only assume the school trippers, which just drive around Crescent City a couple times a day, and the Saturday, which is not that extensive. So that's why it's pretty much the current service level that you're seeing.
So it's our projections. We really started making projections in 1920 to 23, 24. We didn't really go back and
Chris, I have a question
Thank you.
on when we're looking at financial plan, and I've been waiting for you to discuss this because we brought this up at our last meeting, wages.
Yes.
Now, we had a very serious discussion at our April 22nd meeting. Not everyone here in this, on the authority was there, but if I may be so bold as to say, I think this trumps just about everything that we're doing in your report, is that we definitely have a morale problem on our authority, the drivers and the employees, but mostly the drivers, that we're not anywhere near what we should be paying these drivers, and that's creating quite a serious problem. Maybe not yet, but drivers are overworked, and we need to address that. Now, I don't see it here in any of your chapters about addressing wages. I don't see a comparative analysis with other agencies that you may have surveyed. Can you address that? Or is that not in
A
your
detailed
survey?
wage analysis was, I have done that for several other agencies, but that was not part of our
Okay.
scope of work here. And this just came up in April. We had started our scope long before that. Now,
Now,
having
just let me-
said
let me,
that, having said that, I
Go ahead.
think part of the reason that your overall costs are increasing at a much higher rate than inflation is that with the minimum wage going up, when they put their proposal together originally, irrespective of the current wage problem that you're having right now, the costs were much higher than the inflation rate. And that's why, for example, their fixed costs increase, which include dispatchers, their overall wages, other types of things, increases at a rate of about 4.3% per year. As part of the reason is just that they've made those adjustments. Now, if you want to do something in terms of beyond what their contract is right now, that would be something we would have to really look into and do. But we haven't done that work
I
yet.
think you answered my question that it wasn't part of your purview to review
That's
this.
correct.
And I think that your report is excellent and complete, but what sits in the side of my throat like a toothpick is that we definitely have a morale problem, and I know we're going to address it at some point during the course of this meeting or a subsequent meeting that may make further adjustments to your recommendations on how we proceed in providing safe service when someone is driving one of our vehicles, that they're not only qualified, but they're not overworked and they're not putting our passengers in danger. So
No,
think
I mean,
that's not
safety
your
is first,
purview,
always. So
but, we're going to be taking this up at a future meeting.
Yeah. And, quite honestly, and I'm glad you brought this up, it's part of the reason, and when I showed the graph earlier, when we were looking at comparative cost for vehicle service hour, at the time we did the comparison, I think it was 16, 17 numbers, because that's where we had consistent data. You were at 63, and I remember I said that some of the agencies, like Trinity County is well over 100, Nevada County, Gold Country Stage is well over 100. Their benefits and wages for drivers, which is typically in I haven't calculated it here, but I do a lot of this work, is usually in the neighborhood of 60 to 70% of the total cost of benefits and wages. I haven't, I could easily do it, but I haven't done it here. But that makes a huge portion of it. So if you want to do this, it's something that I think other agencies have addressed in terms of in their contracts or the request for proposals that you didn't do last time. And it's something that you need to seriously look at in terms of, if you do that, this is financially sustainable. If you increase that line item, then something's going to have to give on the service reduction side. I hope you understand what I'm saying, because ultimately, if you're going to increase the costs and the revenues are highly fluctuating, and I've given the best estimate for revenues, something has to give.
No, I recognize that.
Okay.
And I recognize that exactly, but what is our mission? And I'm asking that question rhetorically, is we have to provide safe service.
Right.
And that trumps everything. So when we are putting people in our vehicles to travel from point A to point B, and we have, I guess the only word I can think of is overburdened drivers who are working too many hours to provide the existing service, something's going to give, and we're kind of flirting with danger here. So I appreciate all the observations you made on this, and I think this authority will have to look at some other avenues and how we can make sure we don't have that inevitable accident where we're all looking at each other, and how could that have been avoided. So I appreciate the observations you made this afternoon.
Okay. I'll go on to the next table, which is the budget and projected operating revenues. I've talked about it already a little bit with the fares and the fare study that we're recommending. So the reason that fares are at $139,330 is we feel there really needs to be, and it wasn't part of our scope of work also, to do a really detailed fare analysis from blank slate and really look at this carefully. We do have made recommendations in the plan and the details of it. Back in 2017, you did cut the long-distance fares to like Prairie Creek and Arcata from $30 down to $10. There hasn't been a corresponding ridership increase in terms of that deep discount. And I've done a lot of work for long-distance travel from Trinity Transit, from Yards and Yosemite. A lot of those trips tend to be what we call price inelastic, and that people who really want to take those, long-distance fares, and particularly people who are traveling those distances, a reasonable price is somewhere for that kind of trip is more like $20. So you should be getting at least $20 instead of $10. So we have recommended increasing that from $10 to $20. I don't think it's going to have much impact on individuals. For cash fares, keeping your pass fares the same, so if people want to use it on a really regular basis that is a resident here, it's not going to impact them. But the people who are paying cash fares, you're going to at least get that revenue back. So I've talked already about the Article 4.5 funding. That's the CTSA funding, that line under state revenue sources. I've talked a bit about the ups and downs of state transit assistance, which has gone up substantially lately, but again, we don't know if that's going to go up or down again in future. It's impossible to predict. I also talked about the FTA 5311F. It was at $300,000, and it got cut back to $125,000, and it's going to go back up this next fiscal year to almost $200,000. And the best estimate we can make, having talked to Caltrans and others, it hopefully will stay at that level, but it may not. So that's a lot of, the bottom line here is a lot of the funding sources for transit is a lot of uncertainty, and you have to plan for that uncertainty as part of your job. And that's part of our job, is to give you that guidance in being able to do that. And that's the reason why this plan sets aside the operating reserve that we recommended earlier to get at least 6 months of reserve, so that if, for example, state transit assistance doesn't come in and 2021 at 232,000, it comes in at 180,000, you have the reserves to tap into to be able to do that. And that's really what we want to build. And it's really a high priority in this plan. And so I think that the revenues match the expenses because we use the LTF funding, Article 8 funding, as the final source. And again, in the short term, what we know today, and that comes from sales tax revenues. So if we have a recession, for example, in, God forbid, another big recession in 2021, those revenues went down a great deal. And so again, if you have the reserves, you can tap into it. So hopefully the recession lasts a year or two, you'd be able to tap into those reserves and not have to cut service again. That's the whole idea. And I think it's potentially achievable in the last couple of years, but that may not be achievable in the last couple of years to get $701,000 in Article 8 funding. It's to be determined. It depends on how strong your economy is in terms of, tourism dollars that are spent, sales tax, etc. So it's an unknown. But I've given the kind of the best possible estimates given the knowledge that we have today in terms of what this is, and in building into this plan, plans for known, there are going to be fluctuations, and that you have a way to deal with those. Any questions about that? Okay. All right, I'm going to turn to the capital side, and the next page here. Whoops. Oh, yeah. That's okay. The next page here is on Redwood Coast Transit Fleet. And if you look at the right-hand column, it shows that we have buses that were supposed to be replaced 2013-14, last fiscal year, and this fiscal year. There's a total of 6 buses. And there are 2 of them that are currently in the works, but that means you're behind the replacement schedule right now. And that has been identified, and on the next page is the planned procurement schedule based on fund availability in terms of the approximate costs. So there's about 2 or 3 buses for the next few years that would be replaced. And hopefully if you decide to go with the branding, it would be phased in. So when the new buses are ordered and delivered, they would have the branding scheme that you've decided upon with the new buses. That would be the plan. And so the costs incorporate those kind of thinking, and I think, the next page shows the capital revenues. And the good news about this is that you do have a backlog or a reserve already of what's called the PTMI SEA funds, which is for capital funding. It's a lot of acronyms, but it was originally from Prop 1B back in 2006. I was going to say 2006. And so those monies you haven't spent, and you can tap into those funds, and we do tap into those funds as part of this plan. I just need to take a step back in that when you look at your current fleet and how the buses were paid for, they were paid for through FTA 5311F funding, which is the intercity funding source. That funding for capital is no longer available. There were buses that would paid with ARA funding, which was the stimulus funding. That funding is no longer available. The PTMI SEA funding is all sunset. You have carryover funds, but there's no more funds that are currently available. So there used to be stable capital funding for transit. Most of that's been eliminated. We have FTA 5339 funding, but it's not formula-based. It means that you don't automatically get the money. You have to apply for it, and it's competitive, and we never know for sure whether you're going to get it. Right now, you've been successful. You've got good grant writers that you've hired as part of this team, but we can't guarantee that. And so There is also a lot of uncertainty in this in terms of being able to do. Now, we have the state of good repair, part of SB1, that you're using for the bus stop improvement program. And we built in what you told us last time you'd like to see. You'd like to see at least 3, but when you can at least do, probably 2 bus shelters a year with that money. And so we've talked through using a combination of the PTMI-SEA and applying for these grants that we can replace 2 or 3 vehicles a year for the next few years so that you get your fleet up to date. And hopefully this will all work out. But as I just want to point out, there are some uncertainties, particularly with the 5339 funding. But you haven't used what's called Federal Transit Administration 5310 funds, which are agencies can use for like the dial-a-ride service that you currently have that go beyond the ADA paratransit service. So your general public dial-a-ride, which exceeds it, is a good use and would be highly competitive for those funds, but it's also competitive funds. So, for example, in 2019-20, we want to add a second one of those smaller MV1 vans that have wheelchair accessible, just a little sedan is what it is, really. And those are very popular with passengers, and so we're going to use that kind of funding for that purpose. So we've been able to build that in a couple of places here. So again, by the end of the plan, however, where we'll have exhausted all of those reserves, and you won't have any additional reserves because we're going to be exhausting them. And hopefully by then, the whole capital funding picture in state legislation may have to address that. But right now, we don't know that. So the last page is really on the composite profile of operating and capital. It kind of sums it all up. I just have to say again, re-stress the importance of the adaptability of and not really extending services unless you can really think that it's going to be financially sustainable, so that you're not having to increase services and immediately cut back if there's those problems. So with that, if you have anything further to say, Ronnie, I think that's pretty much it. Thank you for indulging. That was a very long presentation. I know a lot of material, but I think you have a lot to chew on.
Thank you, Ronnie and Cliff.
Yeah, thank you guys for coming up. I'm relatively new to this commission, and so this is helpful, very eye-opening. Up next is discussing the August 2019 service changes and implementation date. But before we do that, we're going to take 5 minutes for just a quick recess. Gonna reconvene after that quick recess. Thank you, everybody. I had more water now in the last 2 hours than I have all week, so I needed a break. We are on item 8, discussing the August 2019 service changes and implementation date.
Okay, thank you, Vice Chair Fallman, and thank you for your patience on that last item. It's super huge to our future. So this is pulling from that and talking about what we're going to do this summer. So traditionally, we've done our service changes on July 1st, but that's not set in stone. It's just what's been happening the last few years. This year, because of the timing of this plan just now getting to us on May 31st, and we didn't adopt anything today, we just heard about it, we talked about it. So we're going to adopt on June 24th, leaving us very little time to implement anything on July 1. So I think if you entertain me on this, I'd like to shoot for a mid-August implementation this year to give us enough time for next month we'll talk about and decide what to do, then that'll give me a couple months to implement it. So what we're thinking about is coming from the plan that Cliff and Ronnie just presented to us. We need to talk about whether we want to restore the Saturday service or not. That was cut back in 2017. We just talked quite a bit about that. It's left Saturdays more difficult to use, no question. And then we want to talk about what do we want to do for the schools, because we have a unique opportunity, a confluence of projects coming together. We've got the money to make students free, which is awesome, but if we provide them a crappy product, they're still not going to. They may try it, but they won't stick with it, or they may not try it at all. So what we want to do to be successful is combine the free fare project, the grant, with improvements to the product to get them to school, to and from school in a solid fashion. So what I'd like you to give me the green light to work on planning in the next few weeks is a combination of service changes for the schools, and maybe the addition of a tripper in the afternoon, so put our toes in the water of extra service, but this will keep the costs under control. What Ronnie and I have been brainstorming on is, and I've done this before because school trippers are sort of my specialty in this business. Petaluma, we had about 7 of them. I used to carry 500, 600 kids every afternoon on special trippers numbered in the 300 series on top of our base services. So it can be done. Obviously, we had bigger buses in a more urban environment there. But what I'd like to continue to experiment with is we think we can do deviations to routes 1, 2, and 3, and maybe even 4 a little bit in the morning. That's our local routes in Crescent City, so that they better get kids to school without adding any costs or very, very little. So this would be maybe start them in a different spot a few minutes earlier, deviate them to the school. And the beauty of this is our current ridership in the early morning is really low. So we're not mixing or hurting our current customers. The markets are sort of separating themselves. I think we have the ability to play some games with our routes in the first hour, like around 7 to 8 o'clock, to better serve the kids without hurting anything. So I'd like to experiment and fully develop that concept to both serve the 7:30 breakfast start at the high school and then the 8 o'clock-ish main bell. And I think there will be some tough choices. Without extra trippers, we're not going to be all things to everybody, but it'd be great if we could bring some kids to the 7:30 breakfast from maybe one neighborhood, and maybe the other neighborhood we can get them there by main bell. So combined, we might have 2 productive trips coming into to the school. In the afternoon, we'll continue to try to use that premise of no-cost, low-cost stuff of deviations, but I'm more reluctant to deviate a lot in the 3 o'clock hour because our regular customers are already relying on the service. They're out in force in the mid-afternoon, where in the early morning it's very quiet. So in the late afternoon, the PM bell, I'm more inclined to develop a tripper, which would then, hypothetically, the tripper would be in our yard, so it'd be a new driver coming out with a new bus that would go to the school right after the main bell, let's say 3:15, don't quote me on that for the newspaper, but, and then go ahead and serve the areas that we pick the kids up from in the morning. And it's open to the public, but again, the public's not going to ride it much. It's a kid's bus. So it would get them back home without interfering with our other markets, because we don't want to hurt our existing customers. So that might end up being 1 or 2 hours of service a day, 180 school days a year. So we're not talking a ton of money, a few $1,000, but it could make the whole thing work. So that's, you know, from doing service planning for schools for 20 years, that's what I think we should do. And it's a relatively low-cost way to try to make something happen here. As far as I'm going to go over and try to meet with our main contact at the school district this afternoon, but even if that's unsuccessful, in the next couple of weeks, I think we have an opportunity and a need to iron out how the fares are going to work. So the suggestion from the district, and I think it's right on, is we should use the student ID card. And what we don't have time to come up with a separate piece of fare media by June. It's just not going to happen. This is May 31st. So the best way to do it is in the last 2 weeks of school, if we could promote with the school's help, get your student ID card, use your student ID card all summer. It's a sizzling summer ride free kind of thing. And that'll also prep us for August when the kids come back. We want them to use their ID cards right away to ride the system anyway, right? So that's what I suggest we do, and I'm going to try to enlist the school's support in doing that rather than coming up with a new pass or even an existing pass that's in our drawer that somehow we'd have to sell to them or get them to them at school. It's just, it seems the easiest to make them aware that all of a sudden their student ID card is worth more than it was before. Now you can use it to ride the bus. So that's what I want to do. So I mainly want your input on what you think of those two projects. What do you want to do about the Saturday thing? We don't have, it's not a decision item, but just let me know what you want me to work on the next 3-4 weeks before we meet again on the 24th.
What do you guys got?
I like the student ID. It already exists. It meets all the criteria. For me, I think moving forward, that's great. There has been mention of students getting on the buses up to the river in the summertime if large groups of kids wanted to, you know, get up there, go swimming for the day, and then be able to get back into town. I think that might be a way to create ridership. But also your tourists would, you know, want to get up to your parks up there. And so we're already talking about trying to reach out to that, you know, area as well. But I know there are large groups of kids that want to get up there and they don't necessarily have a ride. So.
Yeah, I think that's something we could put in, because what I was envisioning, tell me if this is a bad idea or not, but if I could put a flyer together in the next week that we could get in the hands of we might need you guys' support pushing the school to cooperate, but if we could get a flyer that they could post or even hand out, but certainly post around the school would be super easy, that would tell about the program. And the river thing's a really cool, like blurbs, like, yeah, you know, get a ride to, you know, fun in the river and stuff like that. Because yeah, their student ID would be good, perfectly good for rides on the 199.
The school district has it's like a online flyer. It's called Peach Jar, and they just send you, I just got one from Mary Peacock, and it's basically just an email, and you can look at, so there's no cost. I mean, you're going to create a flyer, but it's not like you're going to need print costs and paper. And those go out to all the parents.
That's a great idea. And earlier Chuck was mentioning how Facebook marketing is not free, but it's cheap, and this grant can pay for marketing. So it's not really a cost. It's more like how do we execute this in time with a part-time manager and like no time left to do it.
Right.
So the Facebook thing would be a good way to also, but yeah, that's a great deal. So Mary Peacock's no,
the
person
school,
to talk to?
The school district is, but I have a child at Mary Peacock, so I just got a flyer from.
No, that would be great, and that would help get the word out real quick and almost free. Yeah.
Yeah.
So Joe, let me ask you about the staffing for this restoration of Saturday services to weekday levels. I'm just going to go after our last meeting. Chuck, you did a good job convincing me. There were some driver issues. Is this something that's going to put an additional strain on our existing driver manifest at this point, or driver load, that we can effectively do this, irrespective of the money? Do we have the staff to do this?
Drivers that passed their test, and we have them in revenue service now. So our, and also driver that was out on medical leave is back. So we've improved a great deal as far as our staffing situation. Just yesterday I ran a report, and my overtime hours were almost cut in half in the last 2 weeks. So we're on a positive trend there. Wages is still an issue. I was going to look for the opportunity to bring that up till we get that resolved. But as far as the Saturday thing, currently we staff 3 drivers. We will probably add 2 more drivers on the Saturday. And I think we can do it at this point. If our staffing levels stay as they are right now, we're not going to have a problem. We'll be able to do it.
Okay, so Joe, you're recommending that to re-implement the Saturday service to weekday levels? Is that what your recommendation is?
If you turn to page 3 or whatever, to the last page of the staff report, I actually recommend against that, but it's not a passionate recommendation. I agree the current system is hard to manage on Saturdays. I don't agree as much as Cliff does about it, but he and I have been planning forever, so we just don't quite agree on this. It's $16,500 according to my best guess, and that includes like some inflated money for fuel, like maybe a hair more than Cliff projected, but it's in the same range. I really want board direction on whether you guys want to do this or not. I think
let me get some clarity on this.
I'm not real dedicated to it.
What if you're not passionate about this or recommending it, then I'm certainly not either. What is the current schedule, the amended schedule on Saturdays, that you would improve it to weekday levels? So what do we have going on Saturday?
Well, Saturday right now, and this is so it's been cut 2 years ago. What Saturday is right now is 2 of our 4 Crescent City routes run, and they run from 8:30 in the morning to like 6:30, 7 at night. And but it's just the one bus alternating between the 2 routes. So one's missing, so that means 2 routes aren't served on Saturday. So basically, we cut the Crescent City service in half on Saturday 2 years ago to save money in the budget crunch.
And this is the number 1 complaint coming from riders.
It's the number 1 complaint coming from riders. And so the reinstatement would be bringing that second bus back so that all 4 routes operate on Saturday like they do on Monday through Friday.
At a cost of about
$16,500 per year approximately. One thing that came up today, and Fernando Hernandez, our ops manager, safety guy, that he's awesome. He's not here today, but I'm giving him props anyway. He came up with an idea today as we were wrestling with this in our meeting this morning, that we could compromise and we could bring back the second bus but shorten the service day a little. So, maybe we could get it down to like 10,000 or 12 if we maybe shut down a little earlier. So that's possible.
Here's my reluctance in getting on board with this tepid warm recommendation that you have to restore Saturday services. What sticks in the back of my mind is this is a $16,500 expenditure, which frankly I'd like to see go into wages. I mean, I'm going to be very blunt and forward, because that last meeting that we had over at the yard was an impressive one, in which here we are, the riders want an expanded service on Saturdays, and it's going to cost us $16,500. I'd rather take that $16,500 and divert it into supplementing the wages and incentives for more drivers to come into our systems. That's my thinking on it. So I don't even share your tepid support for it. I don't think it's the time to do it. And I'd like to see that extra money be put in an area where we can have the second discussion June 24th about addressing the wages issue. That's my thinking.
If I could pounce on that for a second, I like the way you're thinking, not saying one or the other on the Saturday thing, but I think that's what Cliff and Ronnie were trying to say is This is our financial capability and our projections. So if we want to do more in one area, it has to come from another. So if we want to pay better, whether it's for anything, then we probably have to reduce some service somewhere in order to do so, and vice versa. So this is a good example of that. So you're saying defer the expansion of the service so that we can better take care of our operators.
I'm saying that.
Yeah,
That's
exactly. I
based
think
on
that's
this
what I
report.
understood.
Now, unless there's some dramatic change, and again, Chuck came up here and said, well, suddenly we don't have as much of a replacement problem as we did last month. That's not to say that next month we will have another driver. I mean, it is ebbs and flows. While we have this state of what I'll call homeostasis, a lack of homeostasis and some kind of consistency, I would not be in support of restoring at that expense, with the idea that perhaps those funds can be better allocated in another area.
I agree in principle, but for me, what is important is that the public trusts the service that we're providing. And if the big feedback is that we need to have more routes on Saturdays, then that is what's going to increase ridership, and that will increase greater public trust. Ultimately, what we do if we want to see the wages go up and we want to see everything else go up is that we get more people riding the bus. So, I mean, having more routes has people riding the bus more often. And I understand that there's an expense to that, but everything is an expense. And governments are not businesses. Governments are inherently money sinkers. That's just the nature of the game. And it's disappointing sometimes, but really it's what is needed. And so, I mean, I support the reinstating Saturday service, or at least exploring it. But if, it comes back at the end of summer that it's not working, then we need to look at it again. I mean, I can appreciate the fluid nature of transit in Del Norte County in general, and I can appreciate that at some point these routes may not be there again. So if we have a chance to do it now, then we should do it now and hope that with good work, not just hope, that we'll get some more trust in the public, from the public. And with regards to high school riders, have you guys reached out to the Youth Training Academy at all? Michelle Carrillo and Building Healthy Communities?
I think we talked with them about possible internships a while back,
Yeah,
maybe
I
a
think-
few months ago.
I mean, for me, I was part of that program before I was old enough to drive, and so knowing that there was a bus route to take, I think that could be another venue for young people to get involved with that.
Yeah, especially if it was free.
Yeah.
That would be good.
Exactly.
I would like to bring up, if we want to look at the Saturday thing, I'd like to see the numbers of the ridership for those routes that were discontinued, because I'm pretty sure the ridership was really low on those routes, and that was why we discontinued that service. I don't know that adding it would be that much cost effective as far as adding ridership. So I think that's one thing we would need to know to really evaluate how much of that, people complaining about not having that might be, maybe 10 or 15 people that use the service on a Saturday to go from one place, because most of the major places that are open on Saturday, which is Walmart and Safeway, are covered on those routes that are currently running.
Right.
So I would like to see that.
And I agree, that's a great suggestion, Vidette. So I can definitely go back into the Wayback Machine. We can get some ridership just before the cut, like
Okay.
like this time in 2017, and then look at like last month, and we can see really what's happening with the two. And then if the board will entertain it, I can also come up with Fernando's idea of maybe shortening the service day. I mean, it's a blank slate. We can do what we want to do. So maybe we shorten Saturdays a little to create a little bit smaller platform than Fridays, because it is totally against best practices in this country to have an equal level of service on Saturdays as Monday through Friday. You just never see that. So maybe our Saturday service could be a little shorter. So I can see if that'll save it, how much money that could save us, and bring you a couple alternatives there.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess for me then, it would be to come back with some options on that, but not to exceed the 16.5 that you have there.
Sure.
Whatever the options are, hopefully if they don't, I don't want them to go past that.
Okay.
Okay, any more discussion on this item? No? Okay. Is that a,
I don't know if this is the proper time and I'm not sure about where it is in the previous contract, but I believe in the previous contract, there was an allotted 50,000 approximately dollars that was increased for wage increases for the employees of First Transit that are covering our buses. And I was wondering if, I think, Roger, you were the only one on the board. It was in 2016, October of 2016, I believe.
I remember the discussion. I don't know what, it's a new board now, so what do we want to do with it?
Well, was it ever utilized?
No, it was a discussion item,
Okay.
and I think nothing was decided. It was, I do remember the number, and I do remember the discussion. It hasn't been implemented. We didn't take a vote. I seem to remember and I'll have to look my notes over the past, but there was some funding available to do that.
Can you tell us more about this, Vidette? Because I'm
I'll
drawing
try
a
to get a
blank.
copy of it.
Okay, yeah.
I'll try to get a
Go ahead and
copy of
email
it.
me anything you have on it. Because one thing I do, and I can, as we to bring everyone up to speed, so at the board retreat, the workshop in April, one of our meatier topics was the driver wage and benefits situation, and Roger was definitely involved, listening, and very motivated by that. And I had mentioned at that time that we are going to have to deal with Caltrans. Because Mark Wall tried to intervene on a previous board that I think precludes even Roger, a few years ago, awarded an intervention, I'll call it for lack of a better word, and increased the wages here. And then Caltrans a year later says, no way, pay it all back. And we're not going to pay you for your money. So they withheld our money because they said, oh, it was more than CPI, showing you how out of touch they are in their Sacramento office. So then that caused maybe something related to what you guys are talking about. So then we had to figure out how to stay in compliance with the FTA and get our money through Caltrans and still not welch on what we committed to First Transit. So that item happened in 2016. Right after I got here, we inherited that fun thing. So that might have been related to what we had done because, and the result was we didn't short them. We ended up, we were like out of compliance with the grant for like 3 months, and it went away, but we got to be very cognizant of not reopening and going there again. And I don't know if Caltrans, no matter what we do, I'm not sure they're going to approve anything above the CPI, which is so short-sighted in a state with such high cost of living. So anyway, that's an issue we'll deal with, but the bottom line is First Transit's supposed to bring us a proposal for us to consider. Hopefully it'll be at the June meeting, if not, certainly August. But we got to figure out how we're going to actually do it, if we're going to do anything, how we're going to do it. Because
Right.
Caltrans controls us because we're rural.
So you just mentioned that Caltrans controls this agency to a certain degree. So are you saying that whatever we do will be subject to Caltrans approval? And if that's the case, then should we have the same discussion at our local transportation commission meeting with Tamara Layton?
I wouldn't go to Tamara and the commission yet, because I'm not sure what they can do, because this is a headquarters procurement division issue at Sacramento, but certainly we can see if our local Caltrans folks at least make them aware of it. But yeah, the reason Caltrans controls us, and I know it sounds draconian, but it's because we're rural. All the FTA money is passed through Caltrans to us. It's a choice that the FTA made long ago, whereas urban areas, and even small urban like Petaluma or Santa Maria or whatever, they get the money directly, so they have more. And the FTA really doesn't care if we decide our wages are low and we want to fix it. It's Caltrans that cares. So it's really an interesting situation that we ran into and just got ourselves out of 2 years ago. So we'll need to be creative on how we approach that if we are going to improve things. Probably, anyway, I'm talking too much about a what if, but so First is going to bring us some ideas on what they think would be a good deal. The drivers are getting, as you saw, the cost, they're already going up because First is complying with minimum wage laws and giving them more. So it really comes down to, is it enough or not?
Do you recall Do you recall what Caltrans' justification was for not allowing these wage increases? I mean, surely they had to come up with a reason.
The reason I remember hearing, which made me upset, was that it was above the CPI increase, which is usually about 3%.
Okay, so it's totally on the CPI.
I think it was mostly that. I think also they felt that if we were to do something in an open RFP to where every firm could compete, that maybe it would be a better use stewardship of public money. I see that argument. It makes some sense, but the bottom line is, so, in that case, then if we get to that point, then our next window to do that would be in a couple years, because we don't have to execute the extensions with FIRST. We could go out to another RFP in a couple years, and in the RFP, we could maybe call out a floor on wages. Here's the wage scale, almost as if they were unionized. We'd say, here's the scale, you're going to bid on it. It's a bid away, and then everyone would be bidding an equal playing field in that way. I think maybe Caltrans might like that better, but they were really
Okay, I was just
rigid.
curious. Thank you.
When Mark and the previous board tried to do that.
Okay, we're going to move on now to the one of the penultimate items on the agenda, discussing the draft 2019-20 RCTA budget.
Yep, this is it, and I'll be very brief because my voice is going out. And we're tired. It's been a long one. So here's your second look. Those of the board that were able to attend the workshop in April saw the first look at this. It hasn't changed at all because we kind of ran out of time. We were focusing on the other agenda items. So this is the same preliminary budget that we showed the board back in April. And, its highlights are things to take a look at. Our local and state money is actually very robust this year. But it's a factor of two things. One, the economy's been strong. That's the most important part. But two, the economy was strong a year or two ago, and our annual budgets and claims are based on projected funding, and the economy actually outperforms it sometimes. Sometimes it underperforms. It just depends, on the cycles of capitalism and the market. So we're getting a one-time allocation this year of money that came in above projection 2 years ago. That's how Tamara and the commission do it at the DNLTC, which is really, really great how she does that. So that could happen again next year even, because if the economy stays robust. Because the county auditors, I believe they're taking a conservative 3% increase on the economy, which in a real hot economy is conservative, so then we could come in higher than that. But so what this is putting most of that extra into reserves, and that this also was reflected in Cliff's financials that you'll see in your presentation packet, the charts, where he showed our operating reserves growing from like 360 to 500 after this next year, and that's showing us banking like 150,000 of anticipated TDA, surplus TDA in fiscal year 19-20, which gets us up over 500,000 by the next year, which is in line with what the plan's recommending and what I've been recommending, that we build up our reserves a little bit so that we don't have to continue to do reactive cutting, or we may have the ability to intervene as the board sees fit with some of the wages and bennies things. So yeah, so this budget is very positive. It shows very little service expansion. It shows most of the increase in funding, which is mostly local money. Our federal funding is not increasing much at all, as you'll see. One thing where my preliminary budget differs from what Cliff showed you on his slide earlier is I have reason to believe that our 5311F is going to stay around 158. Cliff showed it going back to 197, but last year we asked for 197 and they cut us to 158 again. So and I've heard from Caltrans that it's not going to get any better. So that number's a little lower on 5311F operating, just above the middle of the page in the gray column. But yeah, other than that, it pretty much matches what Cliff was showing you in general. It shows us replacing a couple buses. This is not the two that we're doing now. This is the this is applying for 2 more. We'll be probably applying for 2 more each year. It's, the 5339 money comes in very slow. We still haven't found out if last year's application's been approved by Caltrans or not, so it's borderline ridiculous. But that is our only true remaining federal bus replacement source, so we'll keep applying for it aggressively. So what else, other highlights to look at? This shows the ops costs. So these are costs that are pretty much labor costs. So the 2 lines, we're now south of the middle of the page on the gray column. So if you look at operating expenses, it shows the maintenance contract going, or management contract going up. That's based on the extension that we just approved for Dan and I, which also includes $10,000 for marketing. The next 2 lines below that are the increase in operations costs for the contract with First Transit, so they went up by about 70-some thousand, and most of that's getting passed through to staff. They just, when I'll have Chuck mention, he's got his moment to talk with you here in a minute. He can talk about the recent raises that were awarded. And then fuel, I continue to use that. I'm worried about fuel costs because they've crept up a lot this winter and spring. So I continue to use that as to guess high on that, which is different than the Cliff table you showed earlier where he was dropping it down into the 130s or so. I'd like to keep it up as a buffer because I do not trust fuel prices. So that's the basic highlights of it. It's a good budget. It shows us, included in here, our assumptions on the service are that and because at the time it went to press, included in this budget shows the Saturday reinstatement and a little bit for school trippers. So it assumes that we come up with a positive on both of those, even though as we talked about, they're not decided yet. So yeah, that's basically the overview of the preliminary budget.
Okay. Any questions, comments? Okay, I got a couple. So the first one is on the reserves. Is there an in-house reserve policy that says every year we will donate, say, X% of revenue to the reserve, or not donate, but allocate?
There is not, but there was almost one. The board, during the process of deciding what to do in that 2017 funding crisis, the board we discovered the reserves, we talked about them, and the board gave some direction, but I don't think we adopted a formal policy. Let me go back and look in our records from 2017, but we came close. It was discussed and the board gave direction on what to do. So we can bring that back. It might be good to adopt a formal policy.
Yeah.
You know,
on that.
I remember that discussion, Joe, about do we want to allocate a certain percentage every year? And that kind of paints us into a corner. If you're faced with a board decision to do that, then that may affect services. I'd like to work toward keeping our budget lean and mean, but I'd like it to be a natural process where we do a good job every year and we put a certain amount of money in there. In this particular case, the increase is 158,000. Is that right here, Joe? Am I reading this correctly?
That's the projection, of course.
Yeah.
That assumes a strong economy in 1920.
Yeah, and there are a lot of ifs here, a lot of variables here. So I think I'd rather not. You can discuss it, but I have to be convinced that it's a prudent and fiduciarily wise thing to do is to allocate a certain amount to reserves, then only have to come back and say, well, we messed up or we made a mistake or we underestimated something, then have to reborrow it. And I think it's just, if we have good stewardship of our budget, then I think we'll just naturally get that reserve. So we'll come back and discuss it at the June 24th meeting.
Yeah, I'm open to discussing it, certainly. So the other question was, is there room in the budget to have a wages and benefits study? Is that something that we think might be helpful?
That's a good idea. Yeah, I mean, we would have no outside funding source that we could just grab and apply for, so we would have to take it out of our general budget and just put less into reserve like this year, but it looks like this would be a pretty good year to do that. we'd have to maybe get some requests for qualifications and get an idea how much a little study like that would cost. But yeah, that's how Mark did this a few years ago when they actually did a mini study, got some significant comps and peer agency information, and then executed an intervention, and then Caltrans still got in the way. But yeah, that is a good way to approach it. And
Okay.
yeah, this would be a decent year to do that. What would the board, well, let me see what the prices might cost us to get a consultant to do that, then I can bring that next time and we can see if we want to go down that path.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, anything else on this item? Nothing? Okay, item 10, announcements.
I don't have anything.
But there was part of our presentation, excuse me. Okay. There was part of our presentation where First Transit did an analysis
Okay.
with other organizations close by. So it may not be nearly as comprehensive as what you're thinking, but I just wanted to point that
Yeah.
out, that we did present that at the last meeting when we talked about wages, if that's helpful.
That is, thank you.
Quick report on what's going on with us. As I said a little bit ago, we've become more consistent with drivers. We got the 2 that we're hired on, and they're now in revenue service and doing a great job, and we had medical leave come back, and so we're in a much better place for staffing than we were since last December. So that's been a great help. But with that being said, the way to maintain that is to keep looking at making sure that our wages are competitive. And First Transit has increased everybody in the neighborhood of 10 to 12% of drivers. I should say it's drivers, not, and my senior staff still got to find a way to take care of them. But the drivers, we were able to raise money. But I think it's fair to say, for future discussion, First Transit's done what they can do. So that'll be part of what I present next time when we have a chance to talk about this. That we've looked at our numbers, have done what we can do. So to continue making this right for the drivers, we're going to have to get creative. We're going to have to look for some help. We had a road call, unfortunately. Had a bus that the smog control system let us down coming up on the other side of Last Chance Grade, so we had to tow it in. But that's the end of the negative stuff. We've done 2 charters since the last time we got together. We did a charter for the Wild Rivers Foundation, helped give a tour to an organization that was looking to maybe bring a significant grant to our community through Wild Rivers. We had a chance to drive them around and give them a tour of our county. Then 2 days later, we did the Del Norte Crescent City Chamber of Commerce Progressive Dinner.
Klamath Chamber of Commerce.
I'm sorry?
Klamath Chamber of Commerce.
Okay, all right. It was a great event. Came off pretty well, and we had a lot of fun. One of the things I wanted to make sure to tell you about that Ronnie referred to is the double map software. The install is scheduled. The install of the equipment is scheduled for the 16th of this month, and then the week of the 24th is when they're going to be here to train us. And so we're looking at that the last week of this month, or well, next month as of tomorrow, of being in the buses and implementing it. I'm pretty excited about it. It's a good software. It's going to help us increase our ability to serve the public and keep track of where buses are at, and hopefully even reduce the amount of phone calls that we get in the office that take away from the dispatcher's job of, where's this bus? Where's this bus? Hopefully people will just be able to pull it up on their phone and say, oh, it's at Walmart now. It'll be to me soon. That kind of thing. Also, First Transit has a safety system called DriveCam, Hughes DriveCam, that we put in the buses. It's mounted usually in the area of the rearview mirror. It has a camera that faces forward and a camera that faces inside the bus itself. And whenever anything happens outside of normal parameters of that bus's operation, it takes the first 12 seconds and the last 8 seconds of that moment. So if a driver has to brake real hard because a car's pulled out in front of them, that's going to kick off the drive cam, and it'll film that first part and the last part, and then it goes to drive cam. They evaluate it, they score it, then they send it to us. We look at the web page the next morning, and see what's happened the previous day. That gives us the ability to coach a driver, or to commend a driver, or to go back to drive cam and say, hey, we're Del Norte County, that's just what we live with, so don't score it anymore. We have that ability to do that with the drive cam system. That will be, I don't have a date on that, but I just know that it's in process and it is coming soon, and that'll be adding to our ability to stay safe. Last thing is just a point of information. I'm out of town all next week. I'm going to Cincinnati for general manager training. Be my first time at headquarters, so that'll be kind of fun. But with that, I'm done. Any questions?
Chuck, I'd like you to, because we only had 3 members of our quorum, I'd like you to share, and it's in our minutes, the concern about the wages with the other member. We've kind of touched on it during the process, but readdress us on this issue. Our drivers are $2 an hour less than the prevailing rate, things that you mentioned there.
Yeah, I should have brought my notes with me, but we are underpaid compared to almost every organization that's out there that does what we do. And with the minimum wage increasing every year, it means that our drivers are actually getting paid less over time instead of being able to increase their wages. We ask a lot of our drivers. There's a lot of stress involved with our jobs. We're asking them to stay safe on difficult roads and difficult weather, and we're asking them to do it for sometimes the same wages that, you know, not to be offensive, but the same wages that we're asking people to flip burgers. Okay, it's just not fair, and it's not right. And the way, you know, I mean, we're doing really well right now at this moment with drivers, but as Roger mentioned earlier, that can change on a dime when I get 2 or 3 drivers that have found out that they can go to Walmart and make more money. Hopefully they're not watching this. Then all of a sudden, you know, the beauty of being a small organization is it doesn't take a lot of people for me to be able to run a good operation. The curse is it doesn't take a lot to happen for me to be up, you know, the creek without a paddle, which is where I've been since December until the last week and a half, where I've had to ask people to work extra hours. I've had to ask my dispatchers to be out driving, and yet still be doing their dispatching paperwork and jobs that they do the rest of the time. And so just when I get in that place, it really puts a strain on our system. It puts a strain on our people, and it gives them the ability to be more unsafe than they would be otherwise. So it's something I'm going to keep championing as much as I can, that we need to continue to increase and become more competitive in our wages, if for no other reason that we are able to stabilize our workforce and stay safer on the road, by having a solid group of people and not asking too much of them, getting them tired, and putting them in a place to fail that we don't want to do that.
So your overtime hours allocated for drivers has diminished since the last time we spoke?
Yeah, and that's because I basically have 3 more drivers than I had before.
Okay.
So it's getting better, but we're still not where we should be compared to other agencies, and where we need to be for just what is in our community, what people get paid for various jobs in our community.
Thank you for that update.
Chuck, can you tell us a little about the recent bumps that they got, and which employees received increases and which
Yeah,
groups didn't?
That was the drivers, all got the 10 to 12% increase, but my senior staff did not. So, but the dispatchers, my safety manager, Fernando, and Nick, the maintenance man, are just getting the regular. Hopefully they're not watching this either. But they're slated right now to get the regular monthly or yearly increase, but it's nowhere near what the drivers got. So that puts me in a position where with my dispatchers and with Fernando, my safety manager, I have drivers that are making more than they are. And they're in leadership over these drivers. And it doesn't sit well with me for that to be the situation, especially when you take in the quality of work they're doing.
I have a question.
Yeah.
When your administrative staff are driving, are they getting appropriate driver wages, or are they still getting the less than the drivers?
They're getting their regular wages.
It's interesting.
Okay.
Thank you.
Chuck. Thank you. Okay, we're going to adjourn to the next RCTA board meeting, Monday, June 24th, at 1:30, right? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, then. Thank you, everybody.
Thank
See you
you.
then.